Hello and welcome to the next in the series from Hastings Digital Museum. We're Glarebit Productions and we're delighted to be working with Hastings Digital Museum to bring you this course on digital photography for beginners. I'm Keith. I will be taking you through things. I am the photographer and the person I'm using to photograph for most of these things is Heather. What we're looking at this first week is composition. That is how you can set up a photograph so it looks very good and pleasing to the eye simply by how and where you've pointed the camera and how you've positioned things within the photograph itself. And in particular, the whole idea of trying to get the best photograph you possibly can straight out of the camera. That is, without using too much in the way of photo manipulation techniques. So every week I'll start with a list of the things I want to look at, and then we'll go through them and then we'll review them at the end. So for this week, these are the things that I want to look at to help you with the composition of a photograph. So let's start by having a look at something called the rule of thirds. What you can do is you can imagine that your screen or your photograph is divided into 9 rectangles, and these rectangles are obviously of equal size, and what we find is that your eye tends not to be drawn to a center line but to be drawn to kind of off center, and in many ways the optimal place to look is on the third, either a third going vertically or a third going diagonally, or even better where those thirds might cross. So for example, here we have a crossing point of 2/3. Now this would be a good place to put the point of focus of your photograph. If you were taking a photograph of somebody's portrait, for example, this would be a good place to put their eye. Or if you're taking a photograph of an object, to try and get these to go through the object, because the eye will be drawn in that direction. Of course, it's not only there. I mean, that is my favorite place for rule of thirds, but it's not the only place. It could be any of those bisecting points, or to a lesser extent any one of those lines. So let's have a look at the rule of thirds as an application. Here we have a nice photograph of the East Hill lift taken from the West Hill. Beautiful sunny day. I think it was Midsummer's Day. Lovely weather. Sea is beautifully blue, the sky is beautifully blue, makes Hastings at its best. It's a lovely photograph of the East Hill lift. It certainly would be a good memory, but could that photograph be bettered? Is there anything you could do just to make that photograph a little bit more outstanding? Is it following the rule of thirds? There's our point of focus, that is the East Hill lift, but it's not quite sitting on the thirds. Here we have the vertical line, and you can see that the lift is just a little bit to the right of it. So if we could just shift, just turn our body just slightly to the left, then we could get that lift bang on that third line. And then likewise on the horizontal line, it's possibly slightly too high. So here we have exactly the same photograph. Is it better? And if it is better, why do you think it's better? What I've done is I've just moved things slightly around so that it fits in with the rule of thirds. Here we are. This is now showing the grid lines on the photograph. You can see that the vertical line to the left passes straight through the tower. The horizontal line doesn't actually pass straight through the lift itself. I considered putting it there, but I didn't quite like it, because one of the other things about all of these rules is that the rules are meant to be broken. Much like playing jazz, the thing to do is to learn to play the music first and then learn to play with it. So anyway, here we had the dissection point there. What was the reason I thought it didn't look quite right? Well, quite simply, I'd found a second section point there, and I got the line of the trees and the line of the sea crossing at that point. So I just moved things slightly so that I've actually got two points there where's the rule of thirds going on. Also, we're coming back to diagonals later, and you can see that that forms a beautiful diagonal line straight across the middle of the photograph, so that just makes things slightly better still. The golden ratio is in many ways a variation on the rule of thirds. It's not quite a third. It imagines that you've got your screen and you divide it into two sections in the ratio 1 to 1.61. In fact, it's 1.61 something. It's a long number. The golden ratio was meant to be used by Leonardo da Vinci a lot, and certainly has been used a lot. And if you start looking at classic paintings, good photographs, old buildings and so on, you can see loads of examples of it. I mean, the Parthenon is meant to be built with the golden ratio as well. Other people say it's a load of nonsense. As far as I'm concerned, it's a variant of the rule of thirds. So then you can take the golden ratio and you can take things further. Here, for example, what has happened is that the screen has been divided into two according to the golden ratio. You then take the smaller part and you can divide that again according to the golden ratio, and then divide it again, and then divide it again. You can go on theoretically ad infinitum. What you end up with is this interesting shaped spiral, and what's meant to happen is that if you can get things to fit on this spiral, or to fit in those ratios all the way through, then it makes a particularly interesting pattern, particularly pleasing to the eye. So, looking at the golden ratio, here we have the lighthouse that's on the West Hill. At night it has a red light inside it, and that red light can be seen from the sea, and if you line it up with a red light that's down by the boating lake, apparently it can bring you straight into Hastings Harbour. So here's a photograph of that lighthouse, and it's there right in the middle of the photograph. Could we better it by using the golden ratio? So if I just move myself just a few paces and realign my photograph, I can now get that lighthouse to fit much better within the golden ratio. I've lost the bench and the sign and the seagulls and the other distractions, so that my point of focus is directly on that there lighthouse. It's not the best photograph in the world because I'm trying to illustrate just this one single point. There are a number of other things that we could consider, and you need to have more than one of these composition things in to make a great photograph as opposed to a good one. But if you draw the lines on of the golden ratio, you can see that the line does go straight through the middle of that lighthouse, and also the crosswise line also goes through the top of that lighthouse. And then if you were to do a golden ratio on the second box, okay, I flipped it over, you can see that actually that tree also is sitting there within the golden ratio, and these are the things up in that corner that are giving that photograph its point of interest. If you start looking at the photograph, you'll see lines all over the place. There are lines in the landscape, lines in natural features, there are lines that humans have put there, there are fences, there are walls, there are roads, there are all sorts of things which will cause lines. And the idea of leading lines is to use lines that will point towards the focus of your photograph, the image of the thing that you are trying to draw the eye to. This is also tied up with things like perspective, of course. So there you are, you're out for the day, you want to take a photograph of somebody you're with sitting on a park bench, for example. So you get them to sit down and you take a snap, and you might think, oh, I won't take it straight on, I'll take it from one side to give it just a little bit more interest. But is it? really that interesting. Because once again, we're talking about moving your feet, we're talking about moving around, we're talking about thinking, well, yes, I might just take a photograph and move on, but if I've got just a couple more minutes, I could just move around and I could see if we do something with this photograph, just give it a little bit more interest. So here, all I've done, the subject is still sitting in exactly the same place. I've moved around and I've also crouched down, so I can now see the lines of the bench pointing towards the focus of the subject. It's not only the lines of the bench, there are many lines on this photograph which are all pointing towards the subject and just giving that photograph a lot more interest. So here what I've tried to do is show you where those lines are on the photograph. And I say they're the obvious ones along the planks of wood of the bench, but there's also a line between the grass and the path. There's also a line from the path pointing towards the subject, and there's also another line through the bush pointing towards the subject, so your eye is being drawn towards the focus of the photograph. Diagonals in many ways are a variant on leading lines. You might find diagonals on man-made features, you might find diagonals in the landscape. They are all over the place, and once again what you're doing is you're looking for things which are pointing towards the subject, you're looking for things which are giving it points of interest. The human eye, the human brain finds diagonals interesting, so it's always worth looking out for diagonals. So we wandered around to see if we could find some examples of some diagonals, and we found these interesting looking shutters by the West Hill Cafe. So I took this first photograph just to illustrate to you how you could use diagonals and not be quite right. The diagonals are not all pointing to the subject. We've got a padlock or something there, and also the seagulls seem to have caused a bit of a problem. So how could we better that? So we just move the subject just a step to their left, my right. Their head now covers that ugly padlock, and the diagonals are now pointing towards them. So let's get on to the idea of a frame within a frame. It's often quite interesting to take a look at what you're trying to photograph and photograph it through something else, photograph it through a pair of trees, or through a doorway or a window or something like that, and we call this a frame within a frame, and that just adds some interest to the photograph. Continuing my walk around the West Hill on Midsummer's Day, looking for things for this presentation, I found this interesting pair of houses, and I thought, yes, here we have a frame. Let's have a look through that frame and see what we can see. It wasn't as interesting as I hoped. There was the top of a building in the middle, and there was some kind of lamppost and a white van, and I wondered what else I could do to better it. So what you need to do is move your feet again, and in this case I moved about 3 meters to the right, and there is this net shed which is perfectly sitting there within the frame, looking absolutely wonderful. It's set off by a chimney also that's sitting right in the middle of the frame, and then above it you have the roof of Hastings Contemporary, which is also reflecting that net shed, making rather a splendid photograph. Unfortunately, in front of the net shed there is a cash point and a telephone box. That's a bit of a shame, because photographically they spoil things. This is where you might consider using some photo manipulation of some kind, just to remove those from the photograph. But as I said before, photo manipulation is not really what we're talking about today. We're looking at composition. Photo manipulation is a whole different set of skills that we'll look at later. So if you take a look at this photograph further, the Rock'n'Roll car park above the Hastings Contemporary is irritating, and it'd be lovely if we could get rid of it. And this is where cropping comes in. Cropping is simply like taking a pair of scissors to a photograph if you've got it printed out and just chopping off the bits that you don't want. There are various very simple computer programs around that will do cropping. Most photographic software will have cropping on it, on your mobile phone, on Windows 10, or most things you will find some kind of cropping function. It's very commonly around about. So I just want to talk about cropping. So here's the area we want to get rid of. So you just pop it through a program. You just need to manipulate the photograph and you can get rid of that irritating car park. I have cropped this photograph and removed those cars to try and make things a little better. It's always worth taking your camera with you because you never know what you might see. When I went out on the afternoon on this photographic expedition around the West Hill on the way home, I just was walking along the road and had never spotted before that one of my neighbours had this beautiful path. The gate and door have been painted beautifully to fit in with it, and I thought, well, look here, we've got multiple frames within the frame, and it's just such a good example. So I've just popped it in as another example of a frame within a frame. When I was at school, I was absolutely fascinated by the whole idea of symmetry. For some reason I found it very interesting, and symmetry being where you get one pattern and then reflected on the other side of the image in exactly the same way. And so here we have an example of symmetry, but it's also just taking it just one step further, in as much that these two boxes or two towers or whatever they might be, okay, they're placed in symmetry within the image, so they're creating something pleasing within the image as much as they're reflecting each other. We've taken it one step further and put a bit of asymmetry into it, in as much that one tower is slightly bigger than the other, just giving it just an extra point of interest. So walking around, I had to find an example for you of symmetry, and here we have Hastings Castle, and I spotted these two towers and the wall and thought that's a really good example of symmetry. I had to walk away. Once again, we're talking about moving your feet to get this perspective, but I think here we have a good example of symmetry, also with an amount of asymmetry in it, which just gives you a little bit of interest to the photograph. Once again, I could have taken this from any angle, but by moving myself around just to get that perspective of symmetry, it just gives the photograph a little bit more level of interest. Right, here comes a bit of a physics lesson. We need to look at contrasting colours, and here we have something called the colour triangle, which is used by both physicists, and it's also used by artists. It's even used by hairdressers in things like colouring hair. And the colour triangle just puts the colours of the rainbow around a triangle. So we've got red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Richard of York got beaten in vain. Well, where's the indigo gone? Well, for the purposes of this exercise, we can just assume that indigo and violet are very similar colours, so it makes it all equal, and it just gives it a bit of balance. The whole idea is that colours that are opposite sides to each other on the triangle will complement each other. So something that's on the point will complement something on the corresponding line opposite it. So red complements green, violet complements yellow, blue complements orange. Colours that are along the same line don't complement each other so well, and then you can use this as a way of contrasting colours within a composition. I mean, there are all sorts of other things behind it. There are all sorts of reasons. It's to do with the wavelength of light and all the rest of it, but I don't think that's what we're looking at now. Continuing our walk around, I found this rather interesting coloured house sitting there on the edge of the West Hill with the grass in front, as an illustration of something that you could do with colour. Now, if you look at the colour triangle, blue and green are next to each other. So these are not complementary colours, they're not contrasting. So how could we better things? So if you move your feet and just take a few steps to the left in this case, you'll notice that the side wall of this rather interesting blue house is a lovely orange colour, and if you look at the colour triangle you'll notice that blue and orange are complementary colours, and here we have a fantastic example of that going on. By the way, to make a really decent photograph you wouldn't just be looking at one of these things relating to composition, you'd be looking to at least 2 or 3 of them. To illustrate my points, what I'm trying to do is just concentrate on one. So rather than producing a really fantastic photograph that's got all the things in it, I'm trying to concentrate on the one thing that I'm trying to illustrate. So if I were taking this further, I would have been looking at rules of thirds and all the rest of it. I can see some symmetry there, I can see some symmetry between those windows, and there are a few other things that we can look at. It's really all about the human eye, or I suppose really about the human brain, and one of the things that the human brain finds interesting and stimulating is patterns that repeat, and therefore it's always worth looking around for repeating patterns, because the viewer will find them pleasing. And the repeating pattern doesn't have to be anything particularly complex. Here we've got a repeating pattern of windows which are just repeating along the side of the West Hill Cafe. We also have within this leading lines, which are okay. They're pointing away from the left-hand side, but they're still pointing towards your subject. Your subject's sitting there in the rule of thirds on the right-hand side, on the vertical, but also on the horizontal. We've got the rule of third going through their eye. Photographically, I'm not happy with the weeds and grass and things which appear to be in the photograph, but as an illustration of a repeating pattern, it shows what I'm trying to achieve, and it gives you an idea of the sort of thing that you can do. Once again, this is straight out of the camera, no messing around with any photo manipulation software. So let's look at the repeating pattern again, and this time just move your subject down to the other end so the lines are definitely pointing towards the subject. It's I would say this one's pretty subjective, which one you prefer. This one's certainly got something about it in as much that the lines do point towards the subject. The rule of thirds are still applying. But what I particularly like about this photograph is that now the subject has moved, we have a fantastic set of reflections of the lifeboat and the sea and the fishing beach behind, which I think gives the photograph a lot of interest. And certainly it's worth looking at reflections when you're taking photographs, because sometimes they can really add some depth to things. The repeating pattern, of course, doesn't necessarily have to be exactly the same. Here we've got a repeating pattern of various round rocks and boulders, but they're definitely a repetition of shape going on here, giving the photograph a bit of interest. There's also a kind of gap in the middle of the photograph that the lines on the rocks seem to point to, and it might be quite interesting if we popped something or somebody into that gap to just add a bit of interest. So I went back on another day to pop somebody into that gap in the rocks, but unfortunately the weather patterns had changed. It's exactly the same time of day, but this just gives you an idea of how changing weather patterns could make a difference to what you're trying to achieve. And rather than go for contrasting colours, I went for colours which were the same kind of hue as the rocks, so the person almost disappears into the pattern. Negative space is one of those strange things, and it's kind of counterintuitive, because what I'm saying is that you focus on your object or your point of focus within the photograph, just in one place, and you leave the rest of the photograph completely blank with nothing in it. Just look at sea or sky or grass or something. And this is called negative space. But once again, it creates interest within the photograph. As I said earlier, it's always worth carrying your camera around with you, because you never know what you're going to see. And here we have a prime example. I was actually looking for something to illustrate negative space, and this kite was flying in the sky, and I thought, well, that's beautiful. If I can get a fantastic photograph of this kite with the sky behind it, I'll have a good illustration here of negative space. And at the very moment I was about to take the photograph, the wind dropped and the kite fell. I followed the kite down with my lens, and the two kids were just running towards it, and I just took. And once again, this is straight out of the camera, no photo manipulation whatsoever. Yeah, I suppose I could have moved it slightly to the left to do rule of thirds and all the rest of it. I've got a rule of third with the grass, and I've got a rule of third with the top of the kite. And it was such a, it was a lovely photograph. I just popped it in just to show you the kind of thing that just might happen. This was taken just outside the old town. It's the old Sacred Heart Convent, and I spotted that the moon had come out, and I thought, oh, how interesting! There's the moon. That would be a fantastic thing to take a photograph of. That would be a fantastic thing to look at. But I couldn't quite work out how to do it. And then I noticed the cross on top of the church, and I thought, well, that would be an interesting thing to take a photograph too. And then I thought, well, I don't suppose I'll be able to get them both in the same shot. So I pointed the camera up, and there they were. They were both in the same shot. I moved it around so that the cross pretty much fitted within the first third, and managed to get the moon in, and the moon sits there in the negative space, and you have a really lovely example of use of negative space. Once again, straight out of the camera. So that's this week. Composition. This is what we looked at, the rule of thirds, dividing it into 9 equal boxes and the bisection points of those thirds. The golden ratio, how if something is slightly off center, it can make the thing more pleasing. Leading lines, how lines in the landscape, lines in the photograph can point towards your subject. Diagonals, which is a variation on leading lines. How if you have a frame within the frame, it can make things more interesting. And how sometimes there's just something in the photograph you just don't want there, or it's just making the composition just not quite right. So how you can really quite simply crop the photograph. Symmetry, how things reflect each other on each side of the photograph, but also how sometimes asymmetry, one side being larger than the other, can make things more interesting. Contrasting colours using the colour triangle, looking for repeated patterns, and the counterintuitive idea of negative space. So to introduce you to the photographic competition, a COVID summer. The idea is to give us a pictorial documentation of this rather unusual summer in Hastings. This can go into the museum archive, where it will sit there for people in the future to just see what things looked like and what we were doing in this very unusual and an extraordinary year. The rules are for this are that any photographs should be taken within the borough of Hastings and St Leonard's, and we would like you please to take it on a mobile telephone. The reason for this is to try and level the playing field and make sure that everybody has an equal opportunity, and it isn't just because you can afford a fancy expensive camera that you've got the better photograph. So it's to make you work hard on your composition and things of that nature, to make sure that you really are concentrating on the photograph that you're taking and not just relying on the technology. For the same reason, we'd like the photographs to be taken straight out of the camera with no photo manipulation other than cropping. Cropping is the only photo manipulation we'd like you to use. Please send your completed photographs to Hastings Museum Facebook page. The URL is there. With the hashtag, please, hashtag HMAG photocomp, If you can send it by August the 3rd, so the photograph could be taken any time in July, and the judging will be on August the 9th, and then we will publish who has submitted the best photographs, but all the photographs will be there for everybody to see. There will be a prize. There will be a set of telephoto lenses for use with a mobile telephone and a mobile telephone tripod. We look forward to receiving them. So, thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed that, and good luck. See you next week.